Hi, this is Steve Addison for the Movements Podcast. Podcast for people who want to multiply disciples and churches everywhere. Well, today we're in Raleigh, North Carolina, talking to Berk Wilson, who's given his life to reaching students in order to reach the world.
Got started when Barbara and I were at Clemson University, and I was finishing up grad school. And even before that, about a few months before I had this conversation with a stranger, really, about God's will. A friend of mine, his father committed suicide, and he called me up the one early morning, and he said, "You got to find my brother Charles." I barely knew Charles. He said, "Our father committed suicide, and you need to find him because I can't get a hold of him and get him on the way home." And so I cut classes for 4 hours looking for him, going in places I didn't normally go. And after I found him, I told him the sad news. He got home, and but I was walking back to kind of my routine, and it was like the Lord spoke. It was like just a thought that I had done all of this rearranging of my schedule, not because I loved Charles, because I barely knew Charles, but I'd done it because I loved George, his brother. He and I had grown up together. We were close friends. And it was like that. The Lord kind of hit me and just said, "Berk, will you at least start opening your mouth to lost people? You may not care about them, but I do." And it was a very kind of like in my face realization. And so I started thinking a lot more about God's heart for lost people. And then I was wrapping up grad school. And about that time, I saw a friend and we were talking, and he said, "What's God been showing you?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to figure out God's will for my life." And his friend, who was a stranger to me, said, "That's the wrong question. The question is, what is God's will, and how will you pursue that?" And I never really thought about that. I always been taught, what is God's will for your life? Look for, but to think about what is God's will, what does God want, and how am I going to be pursuing that? And so with that in mind, I began to look at Matthew 28 and Acts 1:8 and John 20:21, and just all those verses that talk about God having the lost in his heart, and not just the lost around you, but the lost on the nations. And so the real question came, who am I going to team up with to pursue God's desire for all people to hear about it? And so I started kind of stumbling. I kind of grew up not really in a church background, but when I was in college, I connected with a church that kept talking about the Great Commission, even releasing you to be baptizing those who you saw saved, and even doing communion in your home. It was kind of revolutionary for me because I thought, well, the pastor needs to baptize, or a deacon or a deaconess. But the thought of, no, you're responsible, and to help them start obeying right away. And so we moved up from Clemson up to North Carolina, because again, the pastors at the time, Steve and Rogers, they said, we can't reach the world by staying in Clemson. So we've got to start sending people out. And so a friend of mine moved to North Carolina, and he and his wife were moving for a job. And I thought, well, my job's flexible. I just have my own business. So I moved, and we just started from scratch. We entered Chapel Hill, University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and began to just do a lot of sharing the gospel to find people who wanted to meet back with us. But we didn't know a lot about reproducing quickly disciples, and we would just gather them. And then we started a church, and there was more community and attraction based, and just how many people can we get to our Sunday morning, and then from there try to get them in what we called home groups at the time. And we were kind of just, again, poking along, but then we were in the community, and we didn't see this idea of making disciples who made disciples of the nations. And so I thought, hey, let's move back on campus. By that time we were in the Raleigh-Cary area. So we moved to reposition ourselves to start meeting where we're going to have we thought the most impact, and that was college. That was NC State University. And to be able to, you were going to have internationals, you're going to have the next generation leaders. And so we were seeing fruit, we were seeing reproduction, but not nearly as, what we saw like in Acts. And then about 15 years ago, a friend of mine said, hey, I'm going to this conference. Will you come? He's talking about reproducing disciples in a simple and biblical way and doing it quickly. And so we read the book T for T and drove down and met Jeff Sundell. It was kind of an interesting thing because, like I said, I the night before we left, I had a dream of a man, a blonde-headed man with a beard, and it was like, there was nothing profound about it. It was just like when I walked in and I saw Jeff, I said, man, that's kind of the man I dreamed about, and so I'm going to pay attention to what he has to say. So that was a little more kind of oomph in my persuasiveness of listening and learning. And that's when we first were introduced to more of what was called the 4 Fields, 5 Parts. And so we drove back, and we, in our van of leaders, we said we need to quit calling ourselves leaders and call ourselves trainers. Because if we are to teach people to obey, you've got to start training. You just, like a parent, you just don't tell a child to do something. Well, you can, but you get pretty frustrated, but you got to train. And so we came back with the thought that all of our leaders were now going to be training. And so we started meeting every Thursday morning to learn these skills and to practice, be accountable. And so we started seeing reproduction and fruitfulness that way. And I think of Zach Shepard. There are a lot of these trainers that were now not only sharing the gospel, but quickly envisioning them, like with Acts 2:38 and 39, that right away, you need to understand God has called you not just to forgive you, but to reproduce. And Zach started doing this with his friends and the people he was seeing saved. And so we were seeing like 3rd and 4th, even 5th generation disciples that Zach, led Trent, and then Trent led Jeremy, and then to the Lord, and started just passing on what they were learning. And then Jeremy with Keith, and so it started just he's probably the best example. And so we started seeing others did not see quite the fruit that Zach saw, but they were seeing a little bit more, to where they would see someone pray to receive Christ, an immediate challenge of God's heart for others and baptism. And so it kind of took off from there. Some were seeing quick discipleship, others were not. But but Zach Shepard is probably one of the best examples, as well as also Jordan Cook and Darren Williams, Keegan Rice. They started seeing reproduction of disciples, and but Zach's probably the one who saw the most growth in the quickest amount of time through Trent and Faith, and then Paxton. So a couple of guys kind of going that way. So,
What had changed then for him and for others?
I think the big thing that changed was the gospel was a lot simpler, because we did have a long gospel presentation. I mean, it was like 4 or 5 verses about the nature of God, 4 or 5 verses about the nature of man, about heaven, about hell, about what death was, the deity of Christ, 5 or 6 verses about the deity of Christ, and then even just follow up what it is to believe, to repent. And so you had to memorize those verses. You had to, people were listening and receiving Christ, the thought of baptizing them right away was kind of being really emphasized a little bit more. And then so we went from those like 40 to 50 verses gospel presentation to at first it just went to Romans 6:23, and that was real easy to reproduce, but also the challenge that right away after you saw someone come to know Christ, you say, okay, you explain this back to me. Give me 4 or 5 names of people you could do this, you could share this with. And then where's water? What prevents you from getting baptized? And really identifying if you've received Christ, the most obvious thing to do is to be baptized and to kind of start. We didn't say it this way, but trying to communicate living the Acts 2:38 through 47 lifestyle. And that Zach would not just tell people to do it, he would schedule now it was his home church rather than his home group, and because they were responsible to be the body of Christ, but he would start taking each one out and modeling for them and then assisting and watching and then letting them go to start their own group. So those are some things that changed, that the gospel presentation was a lot simpler. The challenge for everybody to be, in the word and proclaiming the gospel. We didn't know the verse at the time, but in Philippians 1:14, when it says, because of Paul, most of the brothers and sisters in Philippi were boldly proclaiming the gospel. And so we said, what's our idea of most? When you hear the word most, you usually think 80 to 90%. You don't think 51%. You think, pretty most. And so we said our goal is that everybody in our home churches will be sharing the gospel on a regular basis with the expectation they will find someone to disciple. And so those little expectations changed. And then the mauling definitely changed, because it wasn't just go tell, but it was like, if you're not, meeting your goal of sharing the gospel, because we did start saying, okay, what kind of goals are you going to set for following Jesus? What kind of goals are you going to meet to fish or really find a person of peace, find somebody? So little phrases changed. And if someone would come like 3 weeks in a row and not, met their goal, then Zach or, myself or somebody would come alongside and say, okay, we're going to learn this. We're going to get this down to where you feel more comfortable. And so that was more the discipleship aspect changed, because up until then, discipleship was more, hey, let's grab coffee together. Let's find out how you're doing, any sin struggles, are you even trying to, share the gospel? But now discipleship was more, you're out. You might still grab coffee together, but you're also out and in the harvest together. That was we leveled up our idea of discipleship. Well, we definitely saw a lot more people pray to receive Christ. We even saw more baptisms. We did not see our Sunday morning grow, because the emphasis was more on, how are you making disciples? Not are you just trying to get people to Sunday morning? Even though we'd see our Sunday morning breathe, like, sometimes we would pop up to around 200 and then it'd shrink. But we were seeing areas of campus and even areas of the community start having pockets of gatherings. And we would call them church starts. They would call them small groups. And it took a while. The nomenclature would change a little bit. And so, but we started seeing where we might have 150 meet with us on Sunday morning, but because of the multiplication of our groups, of our churches, we were seeing maybe 300 in our small churches, but only about 150 would gather with us. And to be honest, some people didn't like that. They thought they thought we were going down the wrong path, and they got upset with us and they left. Um, and it would have been nice if they'd left in a nice way. And it would have been and maybe nicer on my part if I'd have been a little more just say, okay, this is how we're rolling. If you don't want to do it this way, how can we help you? But I was a little more immature and a little more arrogant, and so it got hard, and some people left with some bad feelings.
Hmm.
Now, I mean, I think it's just realizing that, and I've tried to communicate this more and more, and even from a campus perspective, we realize that people are not going to stay. That hopefully, and then, most churches don't have people who really stay very long. I mean, because of the job market and the atmosphere, people move. And so, and I really thank God for Jeff's reminder that reminding people that when you do leave, well, take the friends that you've been discipling and you've made disciples with and start a new church. Don't find a church. And having the mindset of Acts 11 or Acts 8, but Acts 11, that when the people were scattered from Antioch, scattered from Jerusalem, they continued to gossip the gospel together. They gathered, and disciples were made to where they matured. And so so that was more of our perspective after the initial years. The initial years, I think I was just trying to maybe be too heavy-handed and not understand that God calls at different times and places, and I was trying to struggle just to still do this, but we started seeing that happen, and then when people did move, like Zach and his wife Elena and Trent and his wife Faith, they moved up to Norfolk really to focus on Old Dominion, and so it continued on, kind of like a spider plant or a dandelion. You blow it. I don't know whether you got dandelions in Australia, but you just start. And then Darren and Keegan and left. Jordan left with another a guy with a friend down to Wilmington, but that didn't work out well. So he is folded back into Darren and Keegan and working with them. So we started seeing it not just here, but then when people started moving, it started going, and even we started seeing people lead off and go from there. So the early years, I'd say, were kind of rough trying to get our bearings, and then finally it was like, okay, it's okay if people leave. People leave all the time, but we want to make sure they leave with a heart for God, a heart to know how to disciple, and so that went well too.
Mm. So does that mean the local work there in Raleigh, sort of because people are continually turning over, that it stayed about the same size, or what's that been like locally?
Yeah, locally, it's been about the same size, but usually when we only have like 4 or 5, like when Darren and Keegan, they took about 8 to Charlotte, and we could easily absorb that, and we just kind of kept going. Then when Zach and Trent left for Norfolk, we could absorb that. And then when we started having some of the people who were reaching internationals, they ended up moving over and helping Mateo in Cologne and then Morocco. And but we did have a group of about 30 leave 2 years ago. And so that was a little harder to absorb and to adjust. But when it was like, just 4 or 5 leaving, it was easy to absorb. We kept around, 150, 200 on Sunday morning. We looked at our Sunday morning, and I try to communicate that church is really done during the week with your close friends and family. And Sunday morning is a time to gather and celebrate and be envisioned and to pray, and to hear stories so that you don't realize and don't feel alone that we're trying to reach. So it's kind of like a tree. The fruit, the trunk of our tree is at NC State and the surrounding area. And then when the fruit falls, some of it falls close to campus, some of it bounces. And the ones that have bounced a little further, we still kind of keep in circle, in contact with each other. And we try to emphasize the leadership gatherings that we do once a month. And it's kind of like, troubleshooting and how do you solve problems with that monthly leadership. But and then some of them have said, "Hey, Berk, we got this. We love you, but we're going to do our own thing." And so, I am highly relational, so I kind of hurt a little bit to that because I like to keep in touch. But that's they know where to find me, and so that's been good too. The
And so you gather the leaders locally, but what's developed in terms of now a wider network that you've got as people rise up and get sent out?
Yeah, and that's been really fun because I just got back from Florida, and I went in Tallahassee and Gainesville and Jacksonville and then in Athens, Georgia, and so being able to keep in touch with people who like-minded and like kindred spirit about, let's make disciples who make disciples who make disciples until all have heard, until no place left. And so we also do this thing, we call it Link, called Laborers Impacting Nations for Christ. And we started that with the thought of Paul and Silas and Timothy went into Thessalonica, and within about 4 weeks, they left and they saw the church, that young church, be an example to the other churches and even impact Macedonia and Achaia, and the gospel had rung out. And so we said, let's go into new areas and let's see what God might do if we kind of go in there, learn what it is to be a disciple, make disciples, and then kind of keep in touch with the people who continue on. And in fact, Ray Vaughn and Sarah Betty, they were part of the first Link in Columbia, South Carolina, and then we continue to do it. And from that's been exciting because people from Miami came to that for and they were at FIU, and so they went back down to Miami and FIU and started, and the leaders are really sharp, but one of them's in law school, so his time is being taken away, but he's still being focused, and they're seeing some good things happen in Miami at FIU with reproduction. Then we also did the Link over in Omaha, Nebraska, and Jim Wiebelhaus and Matt O'Malley are working with what's called a legacy church, but the church understands that of all of Omaha, they're not going to come, and so they have released Jim and Matt to work with us to continue coaching, and they're seeing some good reproduction of third generation. They've really seen, and they've even gone into Colorado, Greeley, Fort Collins, Texas, Mexico, and so it's been going that way. And then there are people who have left or graduated from NC State in Greensboro, and they're reproducing there, and even Clemson, South Carolina, and like I said, we're looking at Athens, Georgia this summer to really establish some and really help some laborers down there. Rich and Mary Catherine Saplita. And so they're working with a legacy church, but the pastor says anything you can do to help my people start their own churches would be great. And so it's been really neat. So it's when people graduate, we kind of do the dandelion blow. It kind of goes real well. And so and even people have, like I said, they've moved overseas, and so that's been interesting too, to keep up with them. So and even
one of the great missionary movements about, I don't know, 140 years ago, it began on the campuses on the US side and UK.
Yeah,
tens of thousands were mobilized. It's a great heritage.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I mean, I got bit with the mantra, change the campus, change the world. Years ago. It just made so much sense. And maybe I'll think, man, I'm too old to learn a new language, but I can go to campus, reach someone from China, and then they can go back to China. And that's happening. That's happening with this stuff. So yeah, and it's just like when Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya, the person who initially took over was a graduate from NC State. Now, I don't know whether where he was spiritually, but again, yeah, change the campus, change the world. They're the future leaders of our families, of our businesses, of our government, of our churches. And it's like, man, I remember years ago seeing an MTV promotion that talked about, by the time a kid was 14, they would be all into MTV. And I remember seeing that. I said, we got to fight for the youth. And and again, I'm not looking to be the big campus movement here at NC State. I'm looking for 2 to 4 who want more. And if I can find 2 or 4 who want more, they can find a few more like this guy. God just, in some ways, just, even though people leave and when they graduate, this new guy, Bryson, he just kind of fell into my lap. And he said, I know God wants me making disciples. I don't know how to do it. And so he started tagging along. And before I knew it, not only had he started leading people to Christ, he has started his own church. And he's been able to pinpoint somebody in that church to start another group. And this is going to be great because he's a senior. He's heading to dental school. And he and I our last conversation was kind of like the 2 Corinthians 10, 13 through 16 about learning how to, in your sphere, your limited sphere, you can influence somebody to where you can influence an area that you've never been in. And so he loved that. I love that because, again, I don't have to go to China. I can influence enough Chinese here and they catch it and they go on. And so, like I said, I'm still trying to learn English. So
well, thanks for listening. If you're enjoying the Movements podcast, you can leave a review and spread the word through social media or from mouth to ear. I'm Steve Addison for the Movements podcast.